I never imagined that a simple visit from a plumber could turn into the most quietly profound experience of my life. The afternoon light was falling through the kitchen window in that golden way it does in late October, when the sun sits lower and everything it touches seems warmer than it really is. I could smell the chamomile tea I had brewed an hour earlier, still faintly sweet in the air, and the kitchen faucet was dripping in a slow, steady rhythm that had become almost like a heartbeat in the house. Something happened that afternoon that I have carried with me ever since, something I still cannot fully explain but feel every single day. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. It means a great deal to us. I am 71 years old, and I have lived alone in this house for nearly 9 years. My husband, Gerald, passed away the spring I turned 62, and in the years since, the world has grown quieter in ways I never could have prepared for. Not silent, exactly. There are sounds everywhere in an old house. The creak of the floorboards near the bedroom door, the way the furnace clicks on at night like a tired old man clearing his throat, the soft hum of the refrigerator that keeps me company when I cannot sleep. But the quiet I mean is a different kind. It is the quiet that fills the space where another person used to be. I have my routines, and they hold me together. I wake at 6:30, I make my tea, I water the small row of herbs on the windowsill, and I sit in the same chair where I have sat every morning for 40 years. I read, I do the crossword, I take a walk if the weather is kind, I eat dinner at 5:30, and by 8 o'clock the house belongs to the shadows and me. It is a life. It is a gentle, orderly, lonely life. And I had made my peace with it, or so I believed, until the kitchen faucet began to leak so badly that a small puddle formed on the counter every morning. I tried tightening it myself, but my hands are not as strong as they once were. So I called the number a neighbor had written on the back of a grocery receipt, and the next afternoon I opened the door. He stood on the porch with a worn leather tool bag in one hand and his cap in the other. He was perhaps 68 or 69, with silver hair cut short and hands that looked like they had known a lifetime of careful, honest work. He was not tall, but he stood with a kind of steadiness that made him seem solid, like someone who did not rush through the world. His voice was low and unhurried when he introduced himself as David. He wiped his boots before stepping inside, even though I had not asked him to, and when he looked around the kitchen, he did it the way you look at something you respect, not the way you look at something you are measuring. He complimented the herbs on the windowsill, said his mother used to grow rosemary indoors too. I had expected someone efficient, impersonal, someone who would fix the faucet and hand me a bill. What I did not expect was the gentleness in his eyes when he smiled. He set his tools on the counter and knelt beneath the sink with a small flashlight, and immediately the kitchen felt different. Not smaller, exactly, but more present, as if the room had drawn in a breath and was holding it. I could hear the soft clink of metal as he examined the pipes, and his breathing was steady and calm, the way someone breathes when they are completely absorbed in what they are doing. The faint smell of pipe grease and something like cedar drifted from where he worked, and I realized I was standing closer to the sink than I needed to be. I moved to the stove and put the kettle on, not because I wanted tea, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I straightened the dish towel on its hook. I rinsed a cup that was already clean. The house had not held the presence of another person in so long that I had forgotten what it felt like. The way another body in a room changes the temperature of the air, the way you become suddenly aware of your own breathing because there is someone else breathing nearby. He worked quietly, and I stood quietly, and the October light moved slowly across the floor between us. I did not understand the feeling then. I only knew that something about the ordinary afternoon had shifted, the way a familiar melody changes when someone hums it in a different key. He finished tightening something and stood up slowly, pressing one hand against the small of his back, the way men do when their bodies remind them they are no longer young. He turned the faucet on and off, listening, and then nodded once with quiet satisfaction. That is when the pause came. He leaned against the counter and looked out the window at the backyard, where the maple tree had just begun to turn, and he said something simple about how he always thought October was the most honest month because it did not pretend things were not ending. I smiled at that. I told him my husband used to say something similar, that autumn was the season that told the truth. He looked at me then, not with pity, but with understanding, and he asked how long I had been on my own. I said 9 years, and the words came out more quietly than I intended, as if saying the number aloud gave it a weight I usually tried to keep hidden. He nodded slowly. He told me he had been alone for 6 years himself. His wife had not passed, he said, but the marriage had ended in a silence that grew too wide to cross. His children were grown, scattered across states with lives too full to include regular phone calls. He said it without bitterness. He said it the way you describe weather that has already passed. Then he looked back at the faucet and said something I have turned over in my mind 100 times since. He said, "Sometimes the hardest leaks to fix are the ones you have gotten used to." On the surface, he was talking about pipes, but the way he said it, the way his voice dropped half a note and his eyes stayed on the window rather than the sink, I knew he was talking about something else entirely. I felt my breath catch, just slightly, the way it does when someone says something true that you have been keeping unspoken inside yourself. The kettle began to whistle, and I asked if he would like a cup of tea before heading to his next appointment. He glanced at his watch and said he had nowhere particular to be. I poured 2 cups of chamomile and set them on the small kitchen table, the one where Gerald and I used to sit across from each other every evening, the one where only one placemat had been set for 9 years. David sat down carefully, wrapping both hands around the mug the way people do when they are grateful for warmth, even when they are not cold. And then something happened that I still find remarkable. Time changed. The minutes stopped behaving the way they normally do in my house, where they march forward in single file, orderly and predictable. Instead, they seemed to pool, the way light pools on still water, spreading out in every direction without hurrying anywhere. We sat at that table for what must have been an hour, though it felt both much longer and impossibly brief. The rain began outside, soft at first, then steady, tapping against the window like a gentle visitor of its own. He noticed the hinges on the cabinet door above the stove were loose and offered to tighten them. I did not refuse. I did not want the visit to end, though I would not have said so. He moved through my kitchen with a quiet competence that felt like kindness, and I sat with my tea and watched the rain, and neither of us spoke for long stretches, and the silence was not empty. It was full. It was the fullest silence I had known in years. When he sat down again, the light had changed to that deep amber that comes just before evening, and the kitchen felt like a room from a painting, the kind where ordinary things look sacred because someone paid attention to them. He asked about the photograph on the refrigerator, the one of Gerald and me at the lake, and I told him about it. Not just the day it was taken, but what it meant. I told him that what I missed most was not the grand things, not the anniversaries or the vacations, but the ordinary presence of someone who knew how I took my coffee, who could tell by the way I stood at the window whether I was thinking or worrying, who reached for my hand during the opening credits of a movie, not because it was romantic, but because it was habit, because we had been reaching for each other for so long that our hands did not know how to be still when the other was near. I told him the loneliness was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It lived in the small things. In cooking, for one. In having no one to tell when I saw the first cardinal of spring. In the way the evening stretched out with nothing at the other end of it but sleep. He listened the way very few people listen, with his whole body still, his eyes steady, his hands resting on the table, as if he had promised them they did not need to do anything else for a while. And when I finished, he told me his own version of the same story, the apartment that was too quiet, the dinners that took longer to clean up than to eat, the way he had learned to talk to himself just to hear a voice in the rooms. He said he had stopped expecting anyone to understand, and then he paused and looked at me with something I can only describe as recognition. It was the recognition of loneliness, meeting loneliness. 2 people who had been standing on opposite sides of the same silence and had only just realized there was someone else there. We sat for a long moment after that. Neither of us spoke. The rain had softened to a murmur. The tea was cold in our cups, and the kitchen held us the way a cupped hand holds something fragile, carefully, without squeezing. He reached across the table, not quickly, not with any urgency. He reached the way you reach for something you are not sure you are allowed to touch, slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. His hand settled over mine on the table, warm and rough and steady, and he held it there. He did not squeeze. He did not say a word. He simply held my hand the way you hold something that matters, gently, as if it might break, but firmly enough to let it know it would not be dropped. I looked down at our hands together on the table where I had eaten alone for 9 years, and I felt something move inside my chest, something that had been sitting very still for a very long time, like a bird that had forgotten it had wings. I did not pull away. I did not explain it to myself. I did not need to. The warmth of his hand moved through me like afternoon light, finding a room that had been closed too long. And in that quiet, unremarkable moment, in a kitchen that smelled of chamomile and rain, I understood something I had not felt in years. I felt seen. He left just as the streetlights came on. At the door, he put on his cap and turned back and asked if I might like him to come by sometime to look at the porch railing, which he had noticed was coming loose. I said I would like that. He asked if Saturday morning would be all right, and I said Saturday morning would be just fine. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that does not try to be anything other than honest. I told him I would have coffee ready, and he said he took his black, and we both stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the way people do when leaving feels like the wrong direction. Then he walked down the steps and into the damp October evening, and I closed the door and stood in the kitchen alone. But it did not feel the same. The faucet was quiet. The cabinet door no longer hung crooked. The mug he had used was still on the table, holding the ghost of warmth. I picked it up and held it in both hands the way he had, and I looked around the room, and I realized that what he had come to repair was the smallest thing he had fixed. Something in the house had shifted. Something in me had shifted. A door I thought had closed forever had opened, just a crack, just enough to let the light in. I set the mug in the sink and looked out the window at the maple tree, its leaves glowing amber under the streetlight, and I thought about Saturday morning, and I smiled. Life does not stop surprising you. It only changes the way it knocks on your door.